Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and in tonight's video I'm going to be talking about paganism. This is a channel, Lifting the Lamp, which deals with the Western esoteric tradition, magic, mysticism, the occult, as it is based in the Western tradition. And I spend a lot of time talking about stuff that comes from the Golden Dawn and societies such as that, very heavily based in Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, Jewish mysticism, Gnostic Christianity to some extent as well. And when you consider the practices such as ceremonial magic, Kabbalah and all that, which are packaged together as part of the Western esoteric tradition, that's usually what we're talking about. However, there are a lot of practitioners of magic and mysticism based in a Western type of belief system, which identify with a wholly different set of practices, which can be described in terms of paganism or perhaps neo-paganism, even Wicca or witchcraft in the last decade or so. And I want to explore those beliefs a little bit tonight and kind of where I land on them. Because, you know, it's not just the Golden Dawn style ceremonial magic, which is sort of the go-to for a lot of modern magicians. Paganism and neo-paganism has become very popular, and the related kind of loose collection of practices, which gets referred to as witchcraft. There's an estimated 1 million witches in the United States alone, and that statistic is a few years old now. So this is something that's become very popular in the last few years. And as you can imagine, as somebody who has studied magic along the route of the Western esoteric tradition, as it is traditionally defined, I have had some interactions with pagan material, Wiccan material, and things of that nature. Spoken to people who practice it. So I've got a bit of a familiarity with that world, and I've formed some opinions around it, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. My observations about paganism and my thoughts on the whole thing, and whether or not you should become a pagan, or, you know, when you're making that choice for yourself, the sort of things you might want to consider before making your choice. So that's what I'll get into now. But before I go any further in this video, first of all, I just want to say thank you to all of you subscribers and others who showed your support after my previous video on the troubles that I've been having with YouTube. It was really great to hear from all of you, for you to tell me what's been going on your end as a subscriber, whether you've been able to see my videos or not, your support for some of the other initiatives that I outlined, which I've been thinking of doing. It was really encouraging to see all of that. So thank you to all of you for that. So let's get into some definitions first. Where exactly does this term paganism come from? Well, it comes from Christian times, and it was the blanket term that was used to describe anybody who was not a Christian, basically. Although it tends to be used to specifically refer to the sort of pre-Christian practices of people in places like Europe, as well as the Near East, and to some extent the Middle East or Asia. As Christianity was spreading throughout the Western world, there was a line of distinction drawn between the old ways and the new, between the new cosmopolitan enlightened Christian religion and the what were perceived as the sort of backward superstitious pagans. And the term pagan comes from a term referring to people that lived on the outskirts, away from the cities, in the sort of areas where there are a lot of peasants, a lot of farming, disconnection from what were considered the more civilized aspects of life. And the term heathen as well is derived from this figure of speech as one who lives on the heath. And so there was almost like a urban-rural divide, which kind of characterized the divide between Christianity and paganism, and between the old and the new, and particularly the worship of the old gods and the sorts of ways the old gods were honored through sacrifices and things like that, and certain types of rites performed by certain types of people who are often kind of denounced as witches and warlocks, the priests and priestesses of this old religion. And so because this term became associated with the spread of Christianity and the kind of setting up of the sort of the contrast between Christianity and the religions of the lands in which it spread, paganism has become associated with pre-Christian, in particular European kinds of beliefs, Druidic, Celtic beliefs, the sort of Nordic or Germanic paganism, even to some extent the sort of classic Greek and Roman beliefs in the various gods of the pantheon, although Greek mythology and Greek folklore is treated with more respect than these other forms of European paganism, because the classical Greek kind of worldview had such an influence on Christianity, and so it was kind of treated with a lot more respect and derogation than these other sort of barbarian or primitive forms of paganism that were practiced by the likes of the Germanic tribes and the Celtic tribes and so forth. You know, this was a view of the old religions, so-called, which really started to form in Roman times and represented the biases of that particular society. Biases which were then carried on by the church. So that's the historic roots of paganism. And, you know, even though Christianity spread throughout Europe, there were a lot of pagan practices that persisted for hundreds of years longer than a country officially converted to Christianity. And it was usually among the kind of common folk that these sort of what became known as folk remedies in the form of different potions or the use of different herbs, folk tales about different spirits and creatures, which would be regarded probably as demons by Christians. This is the areas where paganism kind of persisted, but eventually it pretty much died out as a religion in its own right, although the echoes of it continued in the form of fairy tales and things like that. But for all intents and purposes, the pagan religions went extinct. And now recently, since the 20th century, really, in earnest, we've seen a kind of resurgence in people claiming that they are pagans and that they follow witchcraft as a religion, and you know, in terms of the old ways of the past. And this phenomenon, it presents itself as a kind of revival or a continuation of those old practices in the distant past. And I just want to get clear on one thing. I don't think that it is a clean continuation. I think when you're looking at the paganism of the ancient distant past, particularly because you're talking about a lot of barbarian societies where there wasn't a lot of written records, we really struggle to piece together a clear picture, and all we have to go on are a few archaeological fragments a lot of the time, and a lot of that knowledge got erased. So what we have is a reconstruction of ancient pagan beliefs, and often there is something of a modern ethos sort of injected into that, which makes it into, I would argue, a more modern type of religion rather than a revival of an ancient one. And often we see paganism through a modern lens, and we have a kind of a reading of it based on modern kind of social issues. So for example, there are a lot of people who are drawn to paganism because of an ecological mindset or environmental mindset. They saw these societies as much more in harmony with nature, having a lot more knowledge of how to utilize nature and have a nature positive kind of mindset instead of one of dominating nature and even being against the world being something as filthy, and the world to come being the true thing that we should look forward to, which is the mindset that a lot of Christians have. And so, because people have this ecological worldview, they see in paganism a reflection of their own beliefs, and they kind of emphasize that element of it quite a bit. But that's really a modern take on a very ancient phenomenon, and impugning something modern onto something very ancient. Similarly, people who very passionate about women's rights will be quick to point out that there were priestesses as well as priests in pagan societies, and they will make a claim that men and women were of equal status in these ancient societies. In some cases were even matriarchal, and they will point to that as something that they aspire to. But again, that is a projection of people's own beliefs a lot of the time. There was a lot of variety within ancient pagan societies. We're not talking about a single religion, we're talking about lots of different cults across multiple different cultures and different tribes and societies living in very different conditions. Some of them it might have been the case that there was an equality between men and women. Some of them might have been matriarchal, and many indeed were patriarchal. Societies which valued a warrior type of ethic above all else. And even in something like Wicca, it claims to be a resurrection of the craft of ancient times, but many of the Wiccan rituals and ceremonies were actually reconstructed not even from ancient Druidic or other pagan practices, but actually from Golden Dawn type of practices. A lot of Gerald Gardner's material was influenced directly by Aleister Crowley, who was not a pagan. He was involved in the sort of ceremonial magic that I've studied, which is worlds apart from the neo-pagan sort of beliefs that I'm describing in this video. So then, why are so many people attracted to paganism? That is a question worth asking, because it's kind of a strange thing if you think about it. We have this modernized world with great technological accomplishments, and a kind of enlightened, supposedly liberal kind of social order, or that seems to be breaking down now. Since 1990 up until about now, it's been the assumption that is the social order. And yet people are looking elsewhere to find meaning. So what is the reason for that? I think there's a few reasons. One is that, the kind of status quo of Western society, up until maybe the last 10 years or so, remained quintessentially Christian. Western nations were Christian nations, all of our traditions came from Christianity and so forth. And I think that there is a truth to that. But a lot of evangelical churches tried to put their stamp on the Christian heritage of the West to say, well, that means that we should be in charge and we should have a theocratic state. And I think that sort of put a lot of people off. A lot of the more fundamentalist kind of forms of Christianity put a lot of people offside for a lot of different reasons, whether it's, because of the role of women in the church, because of other issues around identity or things like that, or just intolerance towards anything and everything that was not rigidly Christian, and having no desire for exploring anything outside of that. But these are sort of some of the things that people were reacting against within Christianity, and they looked to paganism as sort of a way of getting away from the things they didn't like about Christianity towards a belief system which honoured all of the things that Christianity made them feel ashamed for. And then on the other side of the spectrum, if you will, there are people who look to paganism because they are looking at modern society and they see something which is soulless and ugly and reduces people to a statistic. They don't like the bleak, cold, atheistic kind of ideologies that are being forced upon them by this modern society, and find that the great promises of prosperity and enlightenment of the modern world couldn't be further from the truth, and that things are actually quite bad. And many of the reasons why they've got so bad is because of some of the modern presumptions about human nature, which turned out to be not quite true. You know, not to mention the way that, you know, the kind of the destruction that this sort of economic doctrine of endless growth has left in its wake. You know, it's sort of a rejection of modern society to look back to the distant past to see what we practiced then, and you know, to embrace tradition as an antidote to the meaninglessness of modernity and the way that modernity so arrogantly and ruthlessly tries to destroy our past and erase our past. And people are reacting against that by clinging to their past even more strongly. Some of them are doing it by going back to things like Christianity. Some of them are looking to the paganism of the past. And that can account for this rise in people practicing paganism as well. And paganism can address many of the things that modernity or perhaps Christianity don't seem to address to people's satisfaction. And I'll get on to my own views about what I think about that in a little bit. But one area, I guess, where there's a perceived lack in the sort of Christian religions of, you know, of that were taken for granted for so many centuries in the West, is this kind of denial of certain aspects of life and aspects of human nature. And in particular, the denial of the darker aspects of human nature, which paganism seems to do a better job of integrating, of acknowledging, of explaining in a wise way, rather than just saying everything that is, you know, that the church says is good is good. Everything else is of the devil. End of story. That explanation is too simplistic and too rigid and just not good enough for a lot of people. And so, because Christianity is a dualistic religion, and because it's, you know, and perhaps Jesus didn't intend that to be the case, but that's what it has become. Because it is very Manichaean, much the same as the Zoroastrian religion. There's sort of strict ideas about good and evil, light and darkness. And there certainly are forces of light and darkness, and there certainly is a struggle going on a lot of the time between different parts of our nature, different forces in society, representing different things. I'm not denying any of that. But it's more complicated than just two sides. You know, within the darkness, there can be divinity as well. And there is an aspect of the divine which is a dark aspect, which isn't necessarily morally evil, but sort of gets lumped together with evil and demonic stuff by Christianity. There are a lot of ancient pagan gods which were definitely forces for good and order in the world, but also had a darker aspect to them, such as Odin in Norse mythology, a god that I've been learning more and more about on my own journey recently. And I'll talk about that at a later date. And then if you look to ancient Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, you see the appearance of the fierce deities or the fierce gods. And no, Buddhism is not paganism, but the Vajrayana Buddhism of Tibet did have a strong influence from the animistic or shamanic cultures that went before, which would undoubtedly be considered a form of paganism. And one of the sort of figures that emerges in this Vajrayana Buddhism is the fierce god. A bodhisattva has a fierce aspect, which is like a monstrous being who is a defender and a protector who crushes evil. But they're very menacing and very kind of intimidating in their appearance. And when the Christian missionaries went to Tibet and they saw these fierce deities for the first time, they reached the conclusion that the Tibetans were demon worshippers because they didn't have that nuance. They didn't have that sophisticated way of looking at the darker aspects of life. For them, it was all of the devil. And unfortunately, that is the way that modern Christians still look at the darkness, which is why they've got such a repressed shadow. But paganism can deal with this darker aspect of life in a much more truthful and honest and healthy way. And I think that that is one of the things that perhaps draws people to paganism as well. And another big accusation that the Christians like to level against the pagan gods is that they're all demons, which again, I think is an oversimplification. I think that the energy of a pagan god can become demonic if it is frustrated and it is pushed into the margins, if it is pushed into the outer darkness. It can morph into a sort of demonic aspect. But I don't think that the pagan gods per se are inherently demonic. You know, even the pagan gods, which from a moral perspective of our Christian or post-Christian society were quite savage, who demanded sacrifices of human beings and even children in some cases. This is undoubtedly something which is seen as evil in today's society. For most normal, psychologically functional people, it's something that's really awful. But even those gods, like Baal of the Carthaginians, they had aspects to them that were light as well. There was more complexity there. So it's too simplistic to say, oh, they're all demons. Things are not that black and white. So I've spoken a little bit about sort of what I think about the pagan critique, if you will, of Christianity and modernity, and you know, why those are reasons why one might gravitate towards paganism. And everything that I've expressed so far are things which I myself agree with. However, I think that we need to balance up all of the different pros and cons of paganism and Christianity. And I think that Christianity gets quite a bad rap, particularly in this day and age where the media is anti-Christian and trying to just insult and defame Christianity constantly. And so I think that Christianity gets a worse rap than it deserves. And this really started during the scientific revolution. A lot of the claims against Christianity being backward or superstitious or you know, bigoted really were quite exaggerated. When you think about how many universities were founded by the church and, you know, things like that, which just gets forgotten about in the sort of modern liberal sort of version of history. But I think there's actually a lot of things that Christianity did which are really beneficial to the West, and which modern pagans themselves would agree were good things, like the way that women were treated before Christianity was worse, particularly in places like ancient Rome. There was more of a respect for the individual as a result of Christianity and Christian thinking, absorbing much of the early Stoic philosophers in the process, in developing Christian teachings around individual conscience. You know, ideas like human rights emerged from Christianity and Christian morality. All of these things, and there's a great book by Tom Holland called Dominion, which I've reviewed on this channel before, which goes into it in much more detail. It's much too big a topic to discuss in this video, but there's a lot that Christianity brought to the world, which is very beneficial. Just simply from a cultural perspective, to say nothing of the deeper sort of spiritual teachings of the Christ. And I think that that is something which it would be a shame to discard just because of the followers of Christ misunderstanding the message and just making fools of themselves and creating a dogma and a a rigid Pharisaical belief system out of what were meant to be really wonderful, deep teachings. And I also think that for the reasons that I've outlined and hinted at already in this video, to do with the sort of barbarism of a lot of pagan societies and the sort of sacrificial elements to their beliefs, I think that we shouldn't idealize pagan societies too much, because there are things that they practiced which would be considered morally reprehensible by today, and is not something that we should seek to emulate again. Which is not to say that we can't take pieces of wisdom from paganism, which make up for some of the areas that Christian dogma is lacking in. And that's sort of where I land on this whole thing. I'm not a Christian, but I'm not a pagan either. But I can see the good in both of those beliefs. And, I do believe in a God that is one. And I think that there are things about paganism that help me to understand an aspect of the mystery of the divine that Christianity can never tell me about. And so I'm trying to find a way of incorporating things, not to just mix and muddle them for no reason, but in order to better understand the oneness of God. That's basically where I land with all of this. And I think from a metaphysical and a philosophical standpoint, to have an idea of God, which is kind of like the one absolute reality, which is unnameable and invisible and undefinable, is a much more accurate representation of divinity than like the pagan idols are. But we can see the pagan gods as highlighting different aspects of the different mysteries of life, which are all expressions of the divine. So if you see it through that lens, paganism can be an enriching sort of set of beliefs to consider when thinking about spirituality. And in terms of magical practice, I mean, I tried out a lot of the Wiccan rituals when I was first dabbling in the occult. They didn't really do it for me. But, for some people, maybe that sort of witchcraft style of magic is more appealing to them. It's a lot more hands-on. You get to play with candles and oils and earth and leaves and things like that. And that can help people get into the zone a lot of the time when they're doing their magic rituals. If it works for you from that standpoint, then best of luck to you. And I think that just outside of finding a religion or a spiritual philosophy to follow, it can be a deeply fulfilling thing to go back to your roots and to find out what your ancestors believed, the sort of rites that they handed down generation to generation. And it can help you feel connected to everything and feel like you know your place within everything, like few other things really can. And that is why people who have lost their culture and a connection to that culture become like rudderless boats and end up going down potentially some very dysfunctional and self-destructive paths. And I think that one of the great tragedies of not even modern society, but really postmodern society, is that there has been this destruction of the past, and it almost demand that we forget the past and discard our traditions. At least, if we come from a European culture. And I think that it's a terrible thing to lose one's culture. And so I think it's important to know where we came from. The same applies for every ethnic group. If you're someone who is of African descent, go find out about the Orishas and the great stories of of those peoples. And, you know, if you come from First Nations people, reconnect with that culture. You know, I think that it's something that's very valuable that everyone should do. But I think that all of these different ways of looking at divinity and these different religions and belief systems, there's not the strict wall of separation between one or the other that is often represented. I think that Christianity and Judaism were both influenced by paganism, what would be considered now pagan beliefs, at various points in their history. I've done a video on the pagan influences on Christianity, particularly the Greek influences. I've done a video on the Egyptian influences on Israelite religion. Israelite religion was also influenced by Babylonian religion, including its incorporation of astrological themes, such as the 4 cherubim, straight from Babylon. Even though Babylon is used as a symbol of pagan evils in the Bible, it also influenced the development of monotheism. And so you start to see that it's not black and white, you know. And the god Yahweh wasn't even originally an Israelite god. Yahweh was most likely the god of the Midianites that got appropriated by the Israelite religion. And on it goes. And there's one more demonstration that I'd like to do to sort of illustrate how everything's interconnected. And it's probably going to annoy some people, but I don't care, because those people need to open their minds anyway. But these are my runes that I've been using as a form of divination, as I've been going off tarot and you know, researching my own heritage and the things that my ancestors practiced. And so I've started to become very familiar with the runes. And one thing that I learnt about the origin of the runes, which I didn't know before, is that they were probably imported into Germanic societies via the Mediterranean world, and actually have their origin in the Phoenician alphabet, which somehow got transported into Scandinavia and Germany. And you know, the famous Viking ships which traversed the Atlantic even look similar to Phoenician ships, suggesting a connection there. So we have this origin of the runes in Phoenician. There's another magical alphabet that also has its origin in the Phoenician alphabet, which is of course the Hebrew alphabet. And you know, particularly for a lot of this sort of Norwegian kind of neo-pagans that have a lot of connections to some pretty extreme ideologies, you know, Teutonic or Germanic paganism couldn't be more opposed to something like, you know, Hebrew beliefs. And yet we find that both of these magical alphabets from both of these different peoples find their origin in a common source, and perhaps a common source of wisdom to go with it. And so I think that is something that we should remember when we're considering paganism and the Abrahamic faiths. And so everybody was a pagan at some point. And what we're all doing together is we're trying to move towards a better understanding of the divine mystery. And that, I think, has to be the goal, no matter what persuasion or spiritual belief you have. So those are my thoughts on paganism. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel to support my work. And when you do subscribe, please, in a week's time, make sure that you're still subscribed, because YouTube has been doing some weird things on my channel from time to time, so please do that. And if you want to support me further, hit join or thanks down below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.